Please don't shoot. I'll give you strong children if you spare me." He lowered his gun, but the snow wasn't falling. It was slashing sideways, tearing across the barren plain like it had a score to settle. Colt Travers squinted against the wind, the brim of his hat frozen stiff, the rifle in his hand steady but not eager. He had tracked deer across this ridge before, but today there was no trail to follow. Only a figure, half buried in white, waiting. She stood there, not quite upright, not quite collapsed. The shawl around her was soaked through, clinging like paper to skin. Her face was wind-burned, but her eyes were fierce in a way that made him pause. She didn't shiver, didn't scream. Just said, with the kind of stillness that comes from giving up too many times to flinch any more, "If you let me live, I'll give you strong children." The rifle didn't drop, but something inside him did. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. Not desperation, not seduction, just certainty. Like it was a line she'd said before too many times, like she'd memorized her own surrender. But there was steel under the words, hidden behind chapped lips and dirt-smudged cheeks. Not hope, not fear, something older, something tired. Colt had heard bargains before, pleas, screams. This wasn't that. This was a mirror, held up not to him but to something he hadn't wanted to see in years. He looked down at her, the frost building along his rifle's barrel, the sound of the wind screaming around them both. And in that silence between two heartbeats, he did nothing. He didn't pull the trigger, and that was the first choice that mattered. Colt Travers wasn't a man who needed company. He lived far off the road, past the edge of maps, where fences stopped making sense, and even the sun seemed to keep its distance. People who knew him, what few there were, called him dependable, which was their way of saying he didn't talk much and never flinched when it came time to shoot. That morning, he'd set out for meat. The deer tracks vanished halfway up the ridge, swallowed by fresh snow. He didn't curse, didn't turn back, just adjusted his scarf and kept moving as he always had. Then he found her. She wasn't crying, wasn't begging. Just sitting under the low arch of a rock face, arms wrapped around herself, eyes wide but unreadable. The same girl from the field. The one who had offered children like currency. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. He handed her half a blanket and pointed to the fire he'd built with fingers going numb. She came closer, sat across from him, and neither of them said a word for nearly an hour. Colt had taken in strays before, mostly animals. Hurt things, broken things, but this was different. She wasn't broken in the way most folks were. She was quiet in a way that unsettled him. He watched the flames play across her face. Watched her eyes follow the shadows like she was tracking something unseen. She didn't look afraid. She looked prepared, like she already knew how this could end. That was the part that stuck with him. He'd spent years with his finger on triggers, judging who deserved to breathe. But something about this girl made him hesitate, not because she looked innocent, but because she looked like someone who had survived too much to pretend anymore. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't ask anything. But when he tossed her another log for the fire and she caught it with hands that barely trembled, he knew. He wasn't just sheltering her from the snow. He was trying not to see what she reminded him of, and failing. The third night brought a cold that gnawed bone deep, the kind of quiet that made even fire crackles sound like shouts. Colt sat across from her, sharpening a blade more out of habit than need. She didn't move, just stared into the flame like it held some kind of memory. It was then he saw it, just beneath the hairline behind her left ear. A faint welt, raised and twisted, the shape unmistakable to a man who'd seen cattle marked for life. A branding scar, he didn't ask, but his eyes shifted. Down to her wrists, raw skin just barely scabbed over as if she'd been shackled recently and long enough to forget what it was like not to be. Her hands, though, moved with care, precision, the way people do when they've been punished for clumsiness. Still, she didn't flinch when their eyes met. She didn't explain herself, didn't make excuses. She just sat there, the same way she had when he first found her, too quiet to be pleading, too composed to be untouched. Colt had known women who screamed, who fought, who begged for kindness. Mira wasn't one of them. She wore silence like a second skin, not the kind that hides, but the kind that knows nothing good comes from being heard too often. There was a language in her quiet, one he hadn't spoken in years. Each pause was a sentence, each breath a confession. Not that she trusted him, but that she had nothing left to lose by being seen. And somehow that spoke louder than any story she could have told. By the time she finally spoke again, her voice was low, even. People do like it when their property walks off. Colt didn't respond, not right away. He stared into the fire, into the space between them, and realized something heavy. She hadn't just escaped someone. She de-escaped a world that said she was never more than a transaction. That night, neither of them slept much. But when Colt woke just before dawn and saw her still sitting there, eyes open, but the message came the way they always did, carved into bark, tucked beneath a rock, signed with a half-burnt match. Simple terms: turn her in and Colt could go back to being no one. No more questions, no more ghosts. Just silence like before. He didn't answer it, not right away. Back at the cabin, Mira was stirring something over the fire. Not food exactly, just heat and habit. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows, revealing bruises in the shape of someone else's grip. She didn't try to hide them, didn't seem to notice them anymore. When she caught him watching, she didn't flinch. She said nothing. Just tore part of a cloth, dipped it in hot water, and handed it to him for the gash on his arm. No questions, no accusations. "You think I followed you," she said softly, not looking up, "but I was already walking that way." He didn't know how to answer that, so he didn't. Later, as they sat in the amber hush of a quiet not earned but borrowed, she spoke again. Her voice was neither bitter nor soft, just plain, like the truth rarely is. "I never begged," she said. "I just learned what men listen to." That landed harder than any bullet Colt had ever dodged. Not because it was cruel, but because it was exact. He looked at her, not the scars, not the stillness, but the way she held herself upright, like even if the roof collapsed, she'd be the last thing left standing. He thought of the message, of the life he could have back, the silence, the solitude. Then he thought of the way she moved without waiting to be told, the way she never asked him for safety, but built her own around the fire night after night. She wasn't bought to be saved. She wasn't trying to be spared. She was just tired of being someone else's lesson. And for the first time, Colt wondered if maybe some things weren't meant to be left behind. Maybe some things, some people, were worth. The wind had calmed, but danger rarely made noise. Colt knew the signs: bent twigs where there shouldn't be, the sudden stillness of birds, the faint crunch of snow that didn't belong to them. Someone was coming, maybe more than one, and they knew where to look. He didn't say anything, just handed Mira the rifle. She looked at it the way some folks look at old letters, like it held a memory they didn't ask to receive. Then she took it, checked the chamber, and stood guard while he gathered what little they had. The first shot came before they were ready. It wasn't clean. Colt went down hard, a graze along his shoulder, but enough to knock the air from his lungs. He cursed under his breath, tried to rise, but Mira had already pulled him behind a rock outcropping. She didn't cry, didn't hesitate. She knelt beside him, checking the wound with fingers that knew how to press but not how to panic. "They're circling," she whispered, calm like she was naming weather. Then she said it. "If I fall, don't shoot to wound. Aim for the chest. Quick, no waiting." Colt stared at her, blood warming his sleeve, but the cold crawling into his spine had nothing to do with the snow. He'd seen soldiers give orders like that, men who didn't want to be taken alive, but never a woman like her, barefoot days ago, baking bread in silence, now asking for a mercy he couldn't imagine granting. "Why?" he asked, voice barely breath. She looked at him, not blinking. "Because if they get close, I stop being Mira." That name, he hadn't heard her use it before. It hit like truth wrapped in fire. She peeked over the ridge, fired once. The echo rang like thunder. Another figure dropped, maybe two left now. Colt tried to sit up, failed. She shoved him back down, firm but gentle. "I'm not doing this to save you," she said. "I'm doing this so I can end it on my terms." And then she smiled, not soft, not warm, just certain. That's when it broke something in him. All his years wandering, all the people he hadn't saved, all the things he'd let happen with that same silence, none of them made him feel small the way she did now. Not because she needed him, but because she didn't. Because in this moment, with bullets whistling and blood drying on stone, she was the strongest thing in the clearing. And all the forest closed in like it knew something was wrong. Branches snapped behind them, fast and sharp. No wind this time, just boots and breath and men trained to move like ghosts. Colt hissed as another jolt of pain shot through his side, blood now soaking through the rag he'd stuffed under his coat. He stumbled. Mira caught him. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't look back. She just dragged him behind a fallen log, pulled the rifle from his side, and exhaled so slowly it sounded like prayer. The gun felt foreign in her hands, heavy, final, but she didn't flinch. One of them, tall, fast, wearing the red scarf she'd learned to hate, came into view. Before Colt could warn her, Mira stepped into his line of fire and pulled the trigger. It was her first shot. It didn't miss. The man crumpled without a sound. Another bullet whizzed past them, slicing bark and kicking up snow. Mira ducked, then leaned into Colt's ear. "Move or we both die." He tried, failed. She dragged him again, breath ragged now, her boots slipping in the churned frost. They reached the mouth of a cave, barely large enough for two. just as another shot rang out and shattered the branch above them. Inside, she dropped him gently, pressed her back against the stone, and reloaded with hands that had stopped shaking. Colt looked at her, really looked. The girl who'd once bartered her body for breath was gone. In her place stood someone who didn't need saving, just a chance. A fraction more time than the world had given her before. Her jaw was tight, her eyes locked on the cave entrance. "You ever been hunted?" she asked, voice flat. He nodded once. She didn't smile, but something in her face said, "Then you know." This wasn't about escape. Not anymore. This was about not letting them drag her back into a cage she'd already burned from the inside. She didn't shoot for. The first beam went up under a sky the color of smoke. No one marked the land, no one came asking questions. Just Colt, a rusted hammer, and a woman who called herself Mirror. She chose the name one morning when the snow began to melt. He asked her in the gentlest way he knew if Mira was real. She paused, looked into a tin cup half full with cold water and said, "That girl was owned. This one sees herself." From then on, she was Mirror. Not because she needed to rename herself, but because she wanted to remember what it meant to belong to no one. They built slow. Logs for walls, stone for heat, a roof patched with whatever the forest offered. Some nights Colt would whittle wood into shapes with no purpose. Some nights she would sew lines into cloth just to watch her hands move. They never talked about what had happened. Not the scars, not the running, not the way her voice used to falter at the sound of distant horses. It wasn't forgetting. It was making room for something else. Meals were shared in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence here wasn't dangerous anymore. She kept the fire going. He tended to the traps. Days passed like smoke through pine, visible if you looked, gone if you didn't. Sometimes she would sit on the porch and watch the sun cut through the trees like it was learning how to land on her skin. Sometimes he would wake from dreams of gunshots, only to hear her breathing steady beside the fire. They didn't sleep in the same bed, not for a long while, but they existed in the same air, shared the same quiet. It was more than either had asked for. They didn't call it love. They didn't call it anything. They just stayed. And in that choosing, something wholly settled, not loud, not sudden, but real. The last snow came late that year, soft and silent, like it didn't want to interrupt. Colt didn't wake that morning. No gasp, no shiver. Just a stillness that settled over the cabin like it had always been waiting. Mira found him by the fire, his hands folded, his breath gone, but his face oddly at peace. There was no letter, no last words, but there didn't need to be. She sat with him for a long while. The fire crackled. The wind tapped at the window like it, too, was asking permission to grieve. When she finally moved, it wasn't frantic. It wasn't sad in the way most would understand. It was reverent, measured. The way you move when you've watched someone turn into something more than flesh. She wrapped him in the first quilt they made together. The stitches uneven, but warm. She dragged the shovel out before the sun fully broke the tree line. Found the biggest tree at the edge of the ridge, where he used to sit with his coffee, saying nothing, just watching the woods. There was no marker, no cross, just a smooth stone, flat and wide, where she carved with a blade dulled by years. He spared me. I chose to live. That was it. No name. No dates. Because the day he lowered his gun, both of them were reborn into something neither had words for. She sat by that tree until dusk, not crying, not smiling, just there. The same way he'd been stubborn and quiet, soft in places no one saw. When she finally stood, the air was colder, but she didn't shiver. There would be days ahead, firewood to stack, bread to bake, maybe even seeds to plant come spring. But this day, this quiet, aching, unremarkable day was hers. And for the first time since someone else had written the terms of her life, she didn't have to choose between fear and survival. She just chose.